Have any of you heard of the crowded stage idea? It's from literature and theatre. If any of you doing English literature have done it at school. It's when there's too many players on the stage. There's too many characters in the story, and the author needs to tidy things up by writing them out of the script. Well, here in Genesis, the stage is a little too crowded. Thanks to Abraham and Sarah's meddling, there are now 2 wives and 2 sons on the stage. But only one son can inherit the promise. What's going to happen? How is God going to tidy up this mess? Well, let's see in chapter 21 that how the future of both of Abraham's sons is threatened and what God does about it. Well, firstly, we see how Isaac's future is threatened. Isaac's future threatened. Now, this might not be immediately apparent to us as we read this chapter, so let me explain what's happening. We read in verse 8 that the child, and that's referring back to verses 1 through 7, we know that that's Isaac. The child grew and was weaned. Well, in the ancient world, as with many countries today, weaning could happen as late as 3 years old. And as with many countries around the world today, there was a high rate of infant mortality. Many babies didn't make it to this point. And so when they did, it was cause for celebration, which is exactly what's happening here. But Abraham already has a biological son, doesn't he? And by this point, Ishmael is probably between 15 to 17 years old. You know, if you do some maths based on the earlier chapters of Genesis, we can work it out, and he's probably around 15 to 17. He's on the cusp of adulthood. And perhaps he's expecting to inherit everything, which is probably what Abraham had been readying him for right up until the point that Sarah got pregnant a few years ago. And now here is Abraham celebrating Isaac's weaning. Celebrating, in other words, the fact that he now has a child who is likely to survive to adulthood and can inherit as God promised. Well, one day, perhaps the same day, we read in verse 9, Sarah sees Ishmael Isaacing. That's how we could translate this word. It's the play on words, the laughter, because we know Isaac means laughter, doesn't it? The laughter that preceded, because both Abraham and Sarah laughed when they were told, you'll have a son. It preceded, it attended Isaac's birth, because like we saw in verse 6, Sarah said, God has brought me laughter, and everyone who hears about this will laugh with me. Laughter follows Isaac's birth, but here it takes on a menacing edge. Ishmael is mocking Isaac. That's how it's translated here in verse 9. Was mocking. We're probably meant to think back to chapter 16 and remember how Hagar despised Sarah. So this isn't just an older kid making fun or playing around, because you could translate the word playing and it sounds fairly innocent, but we're not meant to think that. This is a supplanted heir jockeying for position in the household. The Apostle Paul, referring to this in Galatians 4, verse 29, says that the older boy persecuted the younger. Ishmael, who we already know will grow up to be a bit of a bruiser, presents a very real threat to Sarah's son. This wouldn't be the first time, would it, that a brother had murdered another brother in the Bible. He has a legitimate claim as well as Abraham's son. They were married. The Bible tells us that, even though she was a slave. Seeing that a common childhood illness hasn't bundled Isaac out of the way, perhaps he's tempted to help things along to secure his claim. Maybe the very act of mocking is something more sinister. It's meant to undermine the idea of Isaac as a worthy heir. And I hope that this helps us maybe understand why Sarah reacts the way that she does. Because it almost seems like an overreaction from us, doesn't it? And she does it with such disdain for Hagar's social position that it does leave us feeling a bit uncomfortable. Her words aren't clear or pragmatic, aren't they? Like, Abraham, there's a danger here, you need to attend to it. She says, what does she say? Get rid of that slave woman and her son. It's not a nice way to respond, is it? But a solution is clear. Get rid of her. That means divorce Hagar. It means give her her freedom. And so disinherit Ishmael. Because, there were ancient laws and there's some dispute around exactly which ancient laws are being applied to here. But if for Abraham to disinherit Ishmael, he needs to give Hagar her freedom. That's the only way it's anything like above board, because he's really his son. And he can't just disinherit him just because she's a slave woman. But if he gives her her freedom, well, that's a different story. Only Abraham, quite understandably, doesn't want to, does he? Because he loves Ishmael. And at this point, God intervenes. Abraham needs to do this because it's through Isaac that his offspring will be reckoned. Verse 12. Now that makes us think back to chapter 12 or chapter 15 or chapter 17. The covenant that God has made with Abraham. The promise that will descend through Abraham's promised line. Blessing will come to all the nations through Isaac. But for Abraham's sake, if for no other reason, Ishmael too will be made great. Just think of the blessing that has come on the world through the fact that Christians are in it. Think of how our own country has such a great tradition of tolerance and freedom. Think of the benefits of the welfare state and the health service. It's all got Christians at its foundation. Just the fact that there are believers in the world mean that unbelievers benefit. I think it's similar here that because of his association with Abraham, Ishmael is promised that he'll be great because Abraham's a friend of God. And the blessing spills over. Abraham does not need to worry about Ishmael. And so, with the word of God ringing in his ears, for the last time, because this has happened before and Hagar came back, but for the last time, Abraham sends Hagar and Ishmael off. Isaac's future, therefore, has been protected. But what about Ishmael? That's the other side of this coin, isn't it? Perhaps some of you are thinking it all just seems a bit unfair, especially when we see Ishmael's future threatened. As with Isaac, his life is at risk, only it's not a potential threat. It's the reality of dying of thirst in the wilderness. They wander in the desert. That means they got lost. Hagar gets lost in the desert and they run out of water. And, it seems that Ishmael's in a dead faint. Well, let me say a couple of things to start with. For one, there is a sense in which Ishmael is reaping the consequences of his abuse of Isaac. Exile, which is really what this is, being cast out, is perhaps a very tame punishment, given what he might have been doing to Isaac. Though he's called a boy throughout this reading, or lad would be a good translation, I especially think that as a northerner. He's not an innocent little kid who doesn't know what he's doing. He's old enough to know better. He's old enough to know about God's promises. And rather than bless himself in Abraham, he decides to curse the child of promise. Well, for another thing, this is a messy solution to a very messy situation, thanks to Abraham and Sarah. You know, in a way they shouldn't be in this situation, but they thought they would, fulfill God's promises themselves instead of waiting for God to do it. As a result, Abraham has ended up with 2 wives. And remember, that is twice as many as the Bible says you should have. The very first person in the Bible to have 2 wives is a very bad person. When Abraham ends up with 2, we're supposed to be thinking of this because it's in the same book, it's in Genesis. It is not a good situation to be in. But sometimes, as a consequence of living in a fallen world where we have messy and broken relationships, there aren't simple or happy solutions to the sticky situations that our sin and the sin of others puts us in. Think of missionary situations today where men have multiple wives. Now, if they're converted, which is what we want, it's what the missionaries want, isn't it? They're sharing the good news. They want to see these people come to know Christ. And if they're converted, what are they meant to do with their many wives? Are they supposed to ditch all but one of them? Sadly, that happens. And then they're left without safety and security. Or we can easily imagine, can't we, the situations which, in a way, we will hopefully face in the next few years. Perhaps same-sex couples with children, and they're converted, and they realise that they're not living the way that God intends for us. But what are they meant to do when they have children together? And they are sort of both of their children. Who keeps the kids? Where do they live if they own homes together? How do you sort that mess out? Sometimes there just isn't a tidy way to fix things, is there? Whatever we do, seeking to honour God, I hope, whatever we do, though, it will lead to heartbreak and hardship. It won't be tidy or neat. It will hurt. And this is even after we've turned to God, by the way. Sometimes we expect if I just become a Christian, then everything will be fine. And that's not always true, is it? Yeah, your sin is dealt with, nailed to the cross, and you bear it no more. It is well with your soul. But that doesn't mean that all your relationships are suddenly going to be fixed. It doesn't mean that all of your addictions are suddenly going to disappear. It doesn't mean that the damage you may have done to your body through the abuse of chemical or whatever it might be is going to just be healed. We bear the scars of our sin in this life, don't we? Well, back to this story. I hope, like me, that you can't help but feel for Hagar and Ishmael. We are meant to. This is a sympathetic account. We're not meant to be like, well, they got what they deserved. Good riddance. Hagar has not had a good run of things, even though she has not always been exemplary in her character. She's a victim as well as an aggressor. And here they are lost in the desert, desperate and without hope. And it's tragic. Hagar isn't blamed for her distress, by the way. It's perfectly understandable given the situation. But for the rest of us, given the Bible that we've got in front of us, and the chapters of Genesis that we've already read, at least those of us who've been working through this book together, we should have a better idea, shouldn't we, of what is likely to happen. Because back in chapter 16, that's kind of a parallel passage. The angel of God, and remember that is the first time that the angel of God appears in the Bible. He appears to Hagar, and he made promises to Hagar about Ishmael. Those promises weren't conditional or contingent. That means they didn't depend on her staying with Abraham or her doing X, Y, or Z. They were promises about what would happen to her son, and they didn't involve him dying of thirst in his teens. I think of that passage in the Gospels where Jesus says to his disciples, let's cross over to the other side, and there's a storm, and they think they're going to die. And they're terrified, and they say, Saviour, don't you love us? And they should have thought, well, he said we're going to cross over to the other side. He didn't say we're going to die in a storm in the middle of the Sea of Galilee. Compare verses 16 and 17 and think about this little. The end of 16 and the start of 17. Hagar begins to sob, and God heard the boy crying. Now you might see there's a little thing about the Septuagint, which is a Greek translation of the Bible, and how they make it the boy. They heard the child crying, or the child began to sob and God heard the boy crying. But in the Hebrew passages we have, it says that she sat there, that's Hagar, she began to sob and God heard the boy. Has Ishmael's name been mentioned at any point in our reading? Just give it a quick look. It hasn't, has it? He's always called Hagar's son, or the son of the slave, or he's called the boy, the lad. But reading this, we know, don't we, that this is Ishmael. This is about Ishmael, Isaac and Ishmael. We know it's not Isaac, so it's got to be Ishmael. We know it's Ishmael. So we've got to be thinking, why aren't you using his name? We're meant to be thinking of his name as we read it, aren't we? Do you know what that name means? God will hear. We're supposed to be supplying the answer ourselves to this situation. Hagar maybe should have been thinking of this, but in her distress it was too hard to bring it to mind, and that's understandable. God made promises about Ishmael, and he will keep them. No matter whether Ishmael deserves it or not, God is with him and provides for him and his mother. Even when we are not, God remains faithful. Ishmael's future is protected. Well, the stage is looking a lot clearer now, isn't it? But we have to ask, who's the good guy in this story? It's always a good question to ask, isn't it, when you're reading the Bible? Who's the good guy in this story? Is it Sarah? You know, she defends her son from a credible threat. That's a good thing to do. But she just seems nasty in the way that she goes about it. Is it Abraham? You see his distress over the son that he loves. You see his obedience to God's command, even though it's difficult. That's a little interesting. I wonder if we're going to see anything like that again in Genesis. We see him provide carefully for Hagar and her son, despite Sarah's insistence to turf them out without so much as a crust of bread between them. But maybe you're still a bit uncomfortable that he does send them out, presumably without a map or escort. There's a bit of food, there's a bit of water, off you go. Well, is it Ishmael? Is Ishmael the hero? No, obviously not. What about Hagar? Again, no. There are already hints here of the violent, contrary man that Ishmael is going to grow to be. We read it later in Genesis. He's against his brothers, all the related tribes. They're in hostility towards each other. Even Hagar's provision of finding a wife from Egypt, which according to her custom was a good thing to do. She was an Egyptian lady, so she gets an Egyptian wife for him. But if you're a Jewish person reading this, just after your escape from slavery in that same country, that's going to strike a worrying chord as well. Who's the hero? Well, you know what I'm going to tell you, don't you? This isn't going to be a surprise to you. God is the hero. That's no surprise. But are you surprised at the means that he uses to bring about his promises? Broken marriages, sibling rivalry, a loving mother convinced that her only son is going to die in front of her and she will die shortly afterwards. Life is messy, but God knows what he's doing. Something we've seen repeatedly through the book of Genesis is that humans make a colossal, a catastrophic mess of things. We can shipwreck our lives, can't we? We can ruin every single relationship around us. Oh, it's this woman you gave me. It's this snake you created. It's not my fault, it's theirs. We can even break the very world that we live in. And when we see that around us, we complain a lot about the weather. We wonder how much of that is our own mess, our own abuse of God's creation, our poor stewardship. And as we think of all these things, all the things that we've made a mess of in the world around us and in our own lives, I think we could feel abandoned by God, left to our own just deserts to wallow in the mire that our sin makes of things. But this passage shines a light into our darkness. Because we see here that God is not only able to save us and bring hope in spite of our brokenness, he's able to use our very brokenness as part of his plan to bring us blessing and joy that we can't even imagine. It's like an artist with a beautiful, clean canvas in front of him. And he gets his brush out, ready to start, when a jealous rival picks up a pot of black paint and throws it all over that nice, clean canvas. Well, at that point, does the artist give up? Does he get his palette knife out and scrape the canvas clean? Just start again? Or does this artist have sufficient skill and vision to work that mess into something beautiful, to incorporate it in his plan, to redeem it? Well, maybe you're here this morning lamenting the brokenness in your own life. Whether it's your own fault or whether you've been sinned against, maybe you despair of there being any future for you other than darkness. And maybe you think, well, that's all I deserve. All I want you to see this morning is how God can and does work. See in the God who would, with the help of wicked men, allow his own son to be put to death by nailing him to a cross, but who would use this ugliness to bring more sons and daughters into his family than can be counted. Whatever brokenness you see in your life, trust in God's sovereign power and vision to bring you blessing and beauty by trusting in his Son, Jesus. Let's sing our final hymn, how deep the Father's love for us, how vast.